Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to follow this story as it unfolds. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single twist or turn in this dramatic journey. The night had fallen over the city like a velvet curtain, dim streetlights casting long shadows across the slick sidewalks, and she walked faster, clutching her coat tighter around her fragile frame. Her heart raced not just from the cold but from the echo of the words he had whispered hours ago, words that still lingered in her mind: "I'll take care of you." There was something in his voice, a soft, commanding gentleness, that made her tremble in ways she didn't fully understand, and yet, despite her better judgment, she had followed him tonight, letting curiosity and something deeper, something dangerous, guide her steps. The restaurant where they had met had long since emptied, leaving the two of them alone in a space that now felt impossibly intimate, every flickering candle casting shadows across his sharply defined features, and she noticed the intensity in his gaze, the way his eyes never left her, as if he could read every fear, every desire she had ever tried to hide. She swallowed hard, aware of the rapid beating of her own heart, and the room seemed to shrink around them, each second stretching into an eternity, every sound amplified, the distant hum of the city, the soft rustle of her coat, the subtle exhale of his breath. He stepped closer, the scent of his cologne enveloping her senses, warm and intoxicating, and when he reached for her hand, she didn't resist, though every instinct screamed for caution. "I promise," he whispered again, his lips brushing her ear, a shiver racing down her spine, "I'll be gentle." She nodded, almost imperceptibly, unsure whether she was surrendering to him, to the night, or to something deeper within herself that had lain dormant for far too long. The first touch was electric, sending a jolt of heat through her body that made her knees weaken slightly, and yet, she felt strangely safe, as if he could hold the world at bay with just a single touch. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, but inside, it was just them, caught in a web of tension, anticipation, and unspoken promises, and as he drew her closer, she realized that tonight, everything she had believed about herself, about control, about love, was about to be rewritten. The flickering candlelight caught the slightest twitch of a smile on his lips, one that was both reassuring and possessive, and she felt the world outside disappear entirely, leaving only the charged intimacy of the moment. Time seemed suspended, each second stretching into hours, and with every heartbeat, she felt both fear and exhilaration, a combination that made her feel alive in ways she hadn't experienced before. Her thoughts raced, conflicting emotions crashing over her like waves. She wanted to pull away, to run, but at the same time, she craved the heat of his touch, the safety in his presence, and the unknown that lay ahead. He whispered her name softly, a sound that made her stomach flutter, and in that instant, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The night stretched on, a delicate dance of restraint and surrender, of gentle caresses and whispered promises, and she knew, deep down, that when dawn broke, she would no longer be the same woman who had walked into that dimly lit room alone. Every brush of his fingers, every lingering gaze, every whispered word was rewriting the rules of her life, and though part of her wanted to resist, to run, she found herself powerless to the pull between them, a force stronger than reason, stronger than fear. By the time the first hint of sunlight crept over the horizon, her heart pounded, her mind raced. And she understood one undeniable truth: tonight had changed her, and she could never go back to the life she had known before he whispered those words. The promise of gentleness had become the gateway to a night that would alter everything, a night where boundaries blurred, hearts entwined, and lives shifted irreversibly, and as she closed her eyes for a brief moment of respite, she felt the weight and thrill of it all. The inevitability of transformation, the intoxicating danger of surrender, and the first taste of a love that demanded everything and promised nothing but intensity. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, painting delicate patterns across the room, but sleep was impossible. Her mind replayed every second of the night, every whispered word, every brush of his fingers against her skin, as though the memory itself had taken root and refused to let go. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she traced invisible lines along the sheets, trying to reconcile the woman she had been before this night with the woman she had become. The city outside was beginning its familiar rhythm, the distant honking of cars and the low murmur of early pedestrians a stark contrast to the intensity she had experienced hours before, yet even in the mundane morning noise, she felt a heightened awareness, as if the world itself had shifted. Every sound, every shadow, seemed sharper, more charged, and she realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that her entire existence had been altered by his presence, by his touch, by the subtle command in his voice that had simultaneously terrified and enthralled her. She recalled the way he had held her, not as a conqueror, not as a predator, but as someone who could see every hidden corner of her heart and choose to protect it, and the thought both comforted and unsettled her, because she had never allowed anyone so close before, never let anyone see the fragile parts of herself that she had always guarded fiercely. Yet with him, those walls had crumbled, brick by brick, not by force, but by a quiet, irresistible pull that she could neither name nor resist. She remembered how his gaze had followed her every movement, how he seemed to anticipate her thoughts, how a simple touch had set her body aflame with sensations she could barely control, and she understood that what had begun as curiosity had now become a need, an almost desperate dependence on his presence, his touch, his whispered promises. She tried to breathe, tried to tell herself that this was temporary, that it was just passion, just a night of reckless abandon, but the truth settled heavily in her chest. She wanted more, and she feared that desire would destroy her if left unchecked. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting her from the spiral of thoughts, and when she saw his name on the screen, a shiver ran down her spine, equal parts excitement and anxiety. With trembling fingers, she answered, her voice barely above a whisper, and he greeted her with a soft, teasing tone, a reminder of the night's intimacy and the way he had taken control of every second they had shared. "Good morning," he said, and she felt the weight of those two words, as though even a simple greeting carried the intensity of the night before. She struggled to respond coherently, her heart racing, because every syllable he uttered seemed to reverberate through her entire body, stirring memories she was both desperate to hold onto and terrified to face. He suggested they meet later, his voice low and reassuring, promising another encounter, another chance to explore the unspoken bond that had been forged between them in those hours of darkness, and she found herself agreeing before she could even analyze her own motives, as if her very instincts had surrendered to the pull he exerted. As the day unfolded, she moved through her routine mechanically, every mundane task filtered through the haze of her thoughts, replaying the night in endless loops, trying to capture every detail, every nuance, every fleeting expression, as though understanding him fully would somehow anchor her in a reality she no longer recognized. Every glance in the mirror reminded her of the subtle changes, the way her lips curved unconsciously, the heat that lingered in her cheeks, the restless energy that coursed through her body, and she realized with a start that her entire being had been awakened in a way she could neither deny nor suppress. Afternoon came, and with it, a mixture of anticipation and dread, the hours stretching long and tortuous as she waited for him, and when the doorbell finally rang, her pulse jumped, her stomach twisting in nervous excitement. He stood there, calm, composed, his usual confident demeanor softened by a subtle vulnerability that made her heart ache, and as she invited him inside, she noticed the way his eyes lingered on her, the way his presence seemed to fill every corner of the room, leaving no space untouched, no thought unclaimed. They spoke at first in cautious, polite tones, but the underlying tension was palpable, electric, drawing them together in a gravitational pull that neither could resist. He moved closer, and the space between them seemed charged with anticipation, each gesture deliberate, each glance loaded with meaning, and when his hand brushed hers accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, she felt a jolt of awareness, an undeniable reminder of the power he held over her emotions, over her body, over her very thoughts. Conversation became secondary to the quiet moments, the unspoken connection that hummed between them like a live wire, and she found herself laughing at small jokes, smiling at fleeting remarks, all the while aware that beneath the surface, something deeper was simmering, something that could no longer be contained. When he finally leaned in, their faces inches apart, she felt the pull of inevitability, the quiet surrender of a will that had been resisting for far too long, and as their lips met in a tentative, searching kiss, every rational thought scattered, leaving only the raw, overwhelming reality of desire and connection. The kiss deepened, tentative at first, then more urgent, as though both had been holding back for fear of the intensity that might follow, and in that moment, she understood fully that this was no ordinary encounter, no fleeting romance, this was a meeting of souls, a collision of hearts, a force that could not be ignored, tempered, or denied. Hours passed unnoticed, the outside world fading entirely, leaving them cocooned in a bubble of sensation, emotion, and connection, and though part of her wondered how she could survive the aftermath, part of her knew she would never want to. When they finally parted, breathless and tangled in the aftermath of their closeness, she felt a mixture of exhilaration, fear, and longing, knowing that the night had changed something fundamental within her, something irreversible. As she watched him leave, a part of her wanted to call him back, to demand more, to surrender completely to the force that had taken over her life, and yet she also understood that the anticipation, the uncertainty, the delicate balance between desire and restraint, was what made the connection so intoxicating. Alone again, she sank into a chair, her mind racing, her body still alive with memory, and she realized that the promise he had whispered, the promise to be gentle, had unlocked a storm inside her, one that would shape every thought, every decision, every heartbeat from that moment forward. She was changed, undeniably, irrevocably, and even as she tried to make sense of it all, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: the night had only been the beginning, and the journey ahead would be far more intense, far more consuming, and far more transformative than she could ever have imagined, a revelation that both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The following evening arrived like a storm she had been both dreading and craving, the city buzzing with its usual frenetic energy, yet nothing could penetrate the bubble of anticipation that seemed to envelop her entirely. Every sound, every movement felt sharper, as if the world itself had conspired to heighten her awareness, to make her hyper-conscious of the events that were about to unfold. She dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that balanced elegance with understated allure, aware that every choice, every subtle detail, could be noticed, remembered, and interpreted by him, though she wasn't certain whether that knowledge thrilled her more than it frightened her. Her phone buzzed with a message from him, simple but charged: "Tonight, it's just us. No interruptions. Be ready." Her pulse quickened, her stomach tightening into knots of anticipation, and she couldn't stop the shiver that ran through her body as she read the words repeatedly, trying to steady herself against the tide of emotion building within her. When he arrived, as punctual and composed as ever, there was a new weight to his gaze, something deeper, more commanding, more intimate than before, and she felt herself drawn in, powerless to resist the gravitational pull he seemed to exert on her very being. He reached for her hand, the brush of his fingers sending sparks of awareness racing through her veins, and she realized with a mixture of awe and apprehension that the night ahead would test every boundary she had ever known, every notion of control, and every measure of desire she could muster. They walked together through the quiet streets, the distant sounds of nightlife fading behind them, leaving only the charged tension between them, the subtle glances, the unspoken language that had grown between them in such a short time, a language that spoke of longing, curiosity, trust, and fear all at once. Every step seemed deliberate, every breath synchronized, and when they finally entered the dimly lit space he had chosen, a private loft overlooking the glittering cityscape, they were met with an atmosphere that was intimate, luxurious, and charged with anticipation. Candlelight flickered across the room, casting long, sensuous shadows across the walls, and she felt her heart pound, her body react, every nerve alive, as though the very air had been infused with electricity. He didn't speak immediately, choosing instead to let the silence stretch, allowing the tension to build until it was almost unbearable, and when he finally moved closer, every inch of space between them seemed to shrink, compressed by the invisible force of attraction, magnetism, and unspoken promises. His hands found her waist, firm but gentle, pulling her close, and she leaned into him, a soft sigh escaping her lips, surrendering to the sensations that had been simmering within her since the first moment their paths had crossed. He whispered her name, low and commanding, sending a shiver down her spine, and as his lips brushed hers, tentative at first, searching, testing the waters, the world outside disappeared completely, leaving only the two of them in a cocoon of heat, tension, and emotion that neither could ignore. Their kiss deepened, exploratory yet urgent, a dance of restraint and surrender, and she felt the rush of adrenaline mixed with a deep, intoxicating longing that had been building since the night they had first been alone together. Every movement, every subtle touch, was a conversation in itself, a language of desire, trust, and discovery, and she realized, with an almost frightening clarity, that she was no longer capable of separating herself from him, that the threads of her being were now intertwined with his in a way that defied logic, reason, or caution. The minutes stretched into hours as they explored the delicate balance between gentleness and intensity, testing the boundaries of pleasure, emotion, and control, discovering new layers of connection that neither had anticipated, yet both had instinctively known were possible. She gasped softly when his hands traced patterns along her arms, her back, the small curve of her neck, every touch igniting a storm of sensation that left her dizzy, lightheaded, and desperate for more, while he remained masterful in his restraint, reading her reactions, guiding her, ensuring that every movement was mutual, deliberate, and consuming in its intimacy. The loft, the city below, the fading light of evening, all became inconsequential, mere backdrops to the raw, unfiltered intensity that existed between them, a force that seemed to exist outside time, beyond reason, and yet so profoundly real that it anchored them both in the most visceral ways. Her mind, once so full of doubts, fears, and questions, was now consumed entirely by the sensations, the emotions, the subtle push and pull of proximity and distance, the gentle dominance and care that he balanced so effortlessly, and she surrendered fully, understanding that this night would define not just her feelings but her very identity in ways she could not yet comprehend. He paused occasionally, eyes searching hers, lips grazing her ear, whispering promises and reassurances that only heightened her awareness, making her realize that the gentleness he had promised was not the absence of intensity, but the careful mastery of it, a control so precise that it elevated every touch, every kiss, every whispered word to an almost sacred level of intimacy. Hours blurred together in a haze of sensation and emotion, and when they finally collapsed together, bodies entwined, hearts racing, and breath coming in short, shallow bursts, there was a quiet understanding that this was only the beginning, that the night had opened a door into a world of connection, desire, and passion that neither could ignore. As they lay together, the city lights casting a soft glow across their entangled forms, she realized that she was no longer just a participant in this dance, but a willing partner, fully immersed in the storm of feeling, aware that the gentle promise he had whispered had become a gateway to something far more profound, far more consuming, and far more transformative than she had ever imagined. The intimacy they shared was not just physical, it was emotional, psychological, spiritual even, a merging of souls that left her feeling both exhilarated and vulnerable, as though the walls she had built around her heart had been dismantled with a tenderness so powerful it could not be resisted. The night ended not with a conclusion, but with a quiet, lingering pause, a moment of shared breath, shared warmth, and mutual understanding that the world outside could wait, that the hours they had stolen together were sacred, and that the journey ahead would challenge, excite, and consume them in ways that were inevitable and irreversible. She watched him leave, again feeling the pull to call him back, to hold on, to not let go, but she also understood the delicate tension, the anticipation that made their connection so intoxicating, and she allowed herself a small, private smile, knowing that the next encounter, whenever it came, would be just as intense, just as consuming, just as transformative as this one had been, and that her life, her heart, and her very sense of self were now irrevocably changed by a single whispered promise, "I'll be gentle." The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments, fleeting glances, and subtle touches that left her simultaneously elated and restless, the memory of that night replaying in her mind. Like a delicate, dangerous symphony, each note more intoxicating than the last, and she found herself unable to focus on anything else, her thoughts constantly drawn back to him, to the warmth of his presence, the command in his voice, and the gentleness he had promised, which lingered in her senses like a flame that refused to be extinguished. She moved through her routine mechanically, answering emails, attending meetings, making small talk with colleagues, all while her mind spun with recollections of the intensity of their encounters, the depth of emotion she had felt, and the undeniable pull that now tethered her heart to his in ways she could not comprehend. Every time her phone buzzed with a message from him, a thrill shot through her body, her pulse quickening before she even read the words, because she had come to understand that every communication carried weight, intention, and a subtle command, a reminder that the bond between them was growing stronger, more intimate, and increasingly impossible to ignore. When he finally suggested meeting again that evening, a surge of anticipation overcame her, mingled with a faint, almost frightening, apprehension, because she knew that the night ahead would be just as transformative, just as consuming as the nights that had preceded it. She prepared herself with care, selecting clothing that highlighted her form without revealing too much, aware that he noticed even the smallest details, and that the power of subtlety, combined with his gaze, could awaken sensations within her that were impossible to resist. When he arrived, his presence was magnetic, almost overwhelming, commanding the space around him, yet tempered with a soft, careful gentleness that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze, leaving her feeling both protected and dangerously exposed at the same time. They walked together in silence for a few moments, the city lights shimmering across the pavement, the occasional distant laughter or passing car accentuating the stillness between them, a tension that was thick, tangible, and filled with promise. As soon as they were alone in the private space he had prepared, a loft adorned with soft lighting, plush furniture, and a subtle fragrance that made the air itself feel alive, she felt the pull of inevitability, the unspoken understanding that nothing they did could remain ordinary or restrained. He approached her slowly, his eyes scanning her face as though memorizing every feature, every subtle expression, and she felt herself melt under the intensity of his gaze, her resistance dissolving with every second that passed. His hand brushed against hers, tentative at first, then more deliberate, and she shivered at the warmth and pressure of his touch, a silent reminder of the promise he had whispered, of the delicate balance between dominance and care that he seemed to command effortlessly. They talked in hushed tones at first, sharing thoughts, laughs, and small confessions, but beneath the surface, an unspoken current of desire and curiosity pulsed steadily, drawing them closer, blurring the line between conversation and intimacy, until every word, every glance, every movement carried a weight that neither could deny. He reached for her face, cupping her cheek with a tenderness that belied the intensity of the moment, and whispered her name, sending a shiver down her spine, making her heart race, making her breath catch, and she realized in that instant that she was utterly, irrevocably drawn to him, body and soul, in a way that defied logic or reason. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, exploratory, testing the waters, building anticipation, and then it deepened, growing urgent, passionate, and unrelenting, a physical manifestation of the emotional storm that had been brewing since their first encounter. Every caress, every brush of skin against skin, was electric, igniting sensations that made her body hum, her thoughts scatter, and her heart pound, a dangerous yet intoxicating combination that left her both thrilled and terrified. As the night unfolded, they moved together in a delicate rhythm, a dance of intensity and gentleness, of trust and surrender, discovering new dimensions of connection, desire, and emotion that neither had anticipated but both had instinctively known were possible. Her mind, once filled with doubts and fears, was now consumed entirely by the immediacy of sensation, the intimacy of touch, and the profound sense of being seen, understood, and cherished, even as every instinct screamed that she should hold back, that she should resist, that she should protect herself from being completely consumed. But resistance was impossible, the pull between them was too strong, the connection too deep, the intensity too overwhelming, and she surrendered, fully, to the force that was reshaping her life, rewriting her boundaries, and redefining her understanding of intimacy, love, and desire. In the quiet moments between touches, between whispers, between shared breaths, she felt the depth of his care, the sincerity of his intentions, and the subtle command that guided every movement, making her feel simultaneously safe and vulnerable, adored and exposed, cherished and possessed. They laughed softly at times, whispered confessions, and explored the boundaries of trust, pushing each other to the edge of sensation and emotion, yet always returning to the grounding presence of the other, a reminder that the gentleness he had promised was not weakness but mastery, a control so precise that it amplified every sensation, every emotion, every heartbeat into an unforgettable crescendo. As dawn approached, casting pale light across the room, she realized that she had once again surrendered herself, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally, aware that each encounter left a permanent mark, reshaping her understanding of desire, connection, and love. The night had been transformative, leaving her both exhilarated and contemplative, filled with anticipation for what was to come, yet aware that the path they were walking was unpredictable, consuming, and irreversible. When he finally left, a lingering kiss and a soft whisper in her ear promising that the journey was far from over, she collapsed onto the bed, heart pounding, mind racing, and body tingling with residual sensation, knowing with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again, that every encounter, every touch, every word, every glance had drawn her deeper into a world of intimacy, desire, and emotional intensity that was as thrilling as it was terrifying, and that the gentle promise he had whispered had become a force powerful enough to reshape her entire life. The tension between them had grown into something almost palpable, a charged electricity that followed her throughout the day, making even the simplest moments feel urgent and alive, as if the world itself had conspired to remind her of the connection that now dominated her thoughts and her heart. She moved through her morning in a daze, her mind replaying the previous nights, the softness of his touch, the intensity of his gaze, the way he seemed to know exactly what she wanted before she even realized it herself, and she found herself longing for the next encounter, aching to feel his presence, to hear his whispers, to surrender once again to the delicate balance of gentleness and intensity that had become both her comfort and her addiction. When his message arrived, simple and commanding, telling her to meet him that evening, a thrill of anticipation ran through her body, mixed with a touch of fear, because she knew that with every meeting, every touch, every lingering glance, the world she had known before him was disappearing, replaced by something far more consuming, far more intoxicating, and far more irresistible. She prepared carefully, selecting clothing that hinted at elegance without revealing too much, aware that his attention to detail was unmatched, and that even the smallest choice would be noticed, appreciated, and perhaps subtly guided by the unspoken understanding between them. When he arrived, calm and composed, yet radiating a magnetic intensity that seemed to pull the very air toward him, she felt her pulse quicken, her breath catch, and her body respond in ways she could neither anticipate nor control. The loft he had chosen was bathed in soft light, shadows dancing across the walls, a subtle fragrance lingering in the air that made her senses alive, and she realized that every element of the environment had been curated to heighten sensation, anticipation, and the intoxicating intimacy between them. They began with conversation, words flowing easily yet loaded with subtext, the kind of dialogue that seemed casual but carried with it an undercurrent of desire, trust, and the unspoken promises that had defined their encounters from the very beginning. His eyes never left her, scanning, memorizing, guiding, while his hands brushed against hers in fleeting, tantalizing touches that sent shivers down her spine, each contact a reminder of the power he held over her body, her mind, and her heart. As he drew closer, the space between them crackling with energy, she felt herself melting into his presence, surrendering to the inevitability of their connection, a connection that had become impossible to resist, impossible to define, and impossible to ignore. Their kisses were slow and deliberate at first, exploratory, teasing, building anticipation like a fire that was both gentle and consuming, and then, as the night deepened, they became urgent, hungry, and unrelenting, a physical manifestation of the emotions that had been building within them, a symphony of passion, trust, and surrender that neither could contain. Every movement was deliberate, every touch measured yet electric, a dance between dominance and care, between control and surrender, leaving her both exhilarated and breathless, aware that with each passing second, the world she had once known was fading, replaced by a reality in which he held the power to shape her desires, her emotions, and her very sense of self. They explored boundaries she had never allowed anyone to cross before, learning the rhythm of each other's bodies, the language of subtle cues, the unspoken rules that guided the dance between them, a dance that was as intoxicating as it was inevitable. Between the intensity of their closeness, they shared whispered confessions, small gestures of intimacy, moments of vulnerability that made her heart ache with a mixture of longing and joy, because in him she had found both the storm and the calm, the fire and the safety, the challenge and the surrender she had never known she needed. Hours slipped by unnoticed, time losing all meaning as their connection deepened, an intertwining of body, mind, and soul that left her lightheaded, trembling, and entirely consumed, yet paradoxically anchored by the gentleness he wielded with such precision, a control so subtle and exacting that it made every sensation, every kiss, every whispered word feel sacred and unforgettable. Even in the quiet moments, when they were simply holding each other, breathing in sync, hearts racing in tandem, there was an intensity that neither could escape, a silent acknowledgement that their bond had shifted something fundamental within her, had awakened desires and emotions that could never be subdued, and had rewritten the rules of her heart, her mind, and her expectations of love. As the night drew to a close, leaving only the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the windows, she realized that she had surrendered again, fully and completely, and that each encounter, each touch, each whispered word had left an indelible mark on her soul, a mark that could not be erased, that could only deepen with every meeting, every shared moment, and every promise whispered in the dark. She watched him leave, lingering in the doorway just long enough to offer a soft kiss and a whispered assurance that this was far from over, that the journey they had embarked on was only just beginning, and that the intensity, passion, and intimacy they had discovered together would continue to grow, consuming them both in ways that were thrilling, terrifying, and unavoidable. Alone once more, she sank onto the bed, mind racing, heart pounding, and body tingling with the residue of sensation, fully aware that the nights they shared were reshaping her, redefining her understanding of connection, and awakening something deep within her that she could no longer deny. She understood that the promise of gentleness had become the foundation of a storm, a powerful force that was simultaneously nurturing and consuming, protective and intense, and that the path she was on with him was irreversible, exhilarating, and utterly transformative. The realization settled heavily in her chest. Nothing would ever be the same again. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word had drawn her deeper into a world where desire, trust, and surrender intertwined in ways that were intoxicating, frightening, and impossible to resist, and she welcomed it, knowing that the nights ahead would push her further, teach her more, and challenge every limit she had ever known. She closed her eyes, the memory of his hands, his lips, his gaze, and his promises replaying in vivid detail, and she understood fully that the journey they had begun together was far from ordinary, that it was destined to be intense, consuming, and unforgettable, and that she was powerless, and unwilling, to resist the force that now dominated her heart and soul. The following days felt like living in a haze, as if the world itself had slowed down just enough for her to notice every detail, every sound, every sensation, yet at the same time accelerated the longing that had taken root deep within her heart, a craving she could neither understand nor resist, because he had awakened something in her that was fierce, raw, and insatiable. Every time her phone buzzed with a message from him, her pulse quickened, a mixture of excitement, curiosity, and a subtle fear coursing through her veins as she read and reread his words, feeling the power behind each one, the gentle command, the intimate promise, the subtle pull that tethered her to him in ways that were both intoxicating and terrifying. She moved through her daily routine like a ghost, her mind consumed by memories of their previous nights together, replaying every whisper, every touch, every gaze, and wondering how something so intense could feel both overwhelming and comforting at the same time. The anticipation of their next meeting was almost unbearable, making her heart race with every thought of him, and when the evening finally arrived, the pull of inevitability was undeniable, drawing her toward him as if gravity itself had shifted to align with the force between them. She prepared meticulously, choosing attire that accentuated her elegance and subtle allure, aware that he noticed every detail, that even the slightest movement or expression would be observed, interpreted, and responded to with precision, and that thought sent a shiver down her spine. When he arrived, calm, confident, and impossibly magnetic, she felt an immediate pull, a heat that began in her chest and radiated outward, making her body react before her mind even had a chance to process it. The loft he had chosen was once again a sanctuary, bathed in soft, golden light, shadows dancing on the walls, and the faint scent of something warm and familiar lingering in the air, and she realized that every detail had been orchestrated to heighten not just anticipation, but intimacy, desire, and connection, creating an environment that allowed every nerve in her body to awaken, every thought to sharpen, and every emotion to deepen. They spoke at first, careful, measured words that carried layers of meaning, yet beneath the surface ran an unspoken current, a rhythm of desire, trust, and the promise of something more, something intense, consuming, and inescapable. His eyes never left her, scanning her face, memorizing her expressions, while his hands brushed against hers in fleeting, tantalizing touches that made her shiver and ache simultaneously, reminding her that the gentleness he promised was not the absence of passion, but the mastery of it, and that every movement would be calculated to awaken, to consume, and to enchant. As he drew closer, she felt the pull of inevitability, the silent acknowledgement that nothing between them would ever be ordinary or restrained, that every gesture, every whisper, every kiss carried weight, intensity, and the potential to alter the course of her life. Their kisses started softly, a delicate exploration, teasing and tentative, but soon escalated into something urgent, passionate, and unrelenting, a physical language that spoke louder than any words could, and as their bodies pressed together, every nerve, every cell, every heartbeat became a symphony of sensation that left her breathless, trembling, and utterly captivated. They moved together in a rhythm that was both deliberate and instinctive, a dance of intensity and surrender, dominance and care, passion and gentleness, discovering boundaries and breaking them, exploring depths of emotion and desire that neither had imagined, yet both had instinctively known were possible. In the pauses between touches, between kisses, between shared breaths, there were moments of whispered confession, subtle intimacy, and profound connection that left her heart aching with both longing and contentment, because in him she had found not only passion and intensity but also safety, understanding, and an unspoken respect that allowed her to surrender without fear. The hours slipped by unnoticed, time dissolving into the heat and intensity of the night, leaving only the two of them in a space where nothing existed outside their connection, where every touch, every glance, every word carried profound significance, and where the promise of gentleness had become the foundation for a storm of emotion, desire, and intimacy that neither could resist nor contain. She felt herself transforming, body and soul, reshaped by the intensity of their encounters, the depth of their connection, and the power of his control, which was always measured, never cruel, always precise, and infinitely compelling. In the quiet moments, when they simply held each other, hearts racing in tandem, breath mingling, she understood the full weight of what had occurred. She had surrendered completely, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally, and the bond they shared was no longer optional or negotiable, it was inevitable, consuming, and irrevocable. As the night drew toward dawn, the golden city lights filtering through the windows, she realized that the experiences they shared had altered something fundamental within her, had awakened a longing, a passion, and a need that could not be satisfied by anyone else, and had redefined her understanding of love, desire, and connection. She watched him leave, lingering just long enough to press a soft kiss to her lips and whisper promises of the future, leaving her trembling with anticipation, exhilaration, and a slight fear of the intensity yet to come. Alone again, she sank onto the bed, body still tingling, mind racing, and heart pounding, the residue of sensation and emotion coursing through her veins, a reminder that the nights they shared were reshaping her, redefining her, and awakening something deep within her that could no longer be denied. She understood fully that the gentleness he promised had become the conduit for a storm, one that was simultaneously comforting and overwhelming, protective yet consuming, intense yet tender, and that their journey together was far from over, destined to escalate, intensify, and transform every aspect of her life in ways she could not yet predict, control, or resist. She closed her eyes, replaying every touch, every kiss, every whispered word, every glance, knowing that the intensity, the intimacy, and the passion that had been unleashed were only the beginning of a force that would continue to grow, consume, and transform, and that the nights ahead would challenge her, thrill her, and redefine her in ways she had never imagined possible, a realization that both terrified and exhilarated her, leaving her utterly captivated by the man who had whispered, "I'll be gentle." The night had a different weight to it, heavier, charged with the kind of anticipation that made her pulse race and her senses sharpen as soon as she stepped into the space he had prepared for them, a private loft bathed in a warm, amber glow that made the shadows dance along the walls and set her skin tingling in ways she couldn't quite explain, as if the room itself had been designed to heighten every sensation, every emotion, every subtle nuance between them. From the moment he entered, calm, confident, and impossibly magnetic, she felt the invisible thread pull taut between them, drawing her closer, making it impossible to resist the heat, the tension, and the undeniable intensity that now defined their connection. His gaze lingered on her with a precision that left her breathless, scanning every detail, memorizing every curve, every twitch of a smile, every subtle movement that betrayed the anticipation and desire coursing through her, and she felt simultaneously exposed and protected, vulnerable and electrified, as if she existed only in the orbit of his presence. They moved together through the room with a rhythm that had been established over the nights before, a silent dance of connection, trust, and unspoken rules, each knowing the other's boundaries, yet continuously testing them, pushing just enough to ignite new fires, new sensations, new depths of longing. His hands found hers, brushing lightly at first, and she shivered as the familiar warmth traveled through her veins, a jolt that reminded her how fully she had surrendered to him, how entirely he had become the center of her awareness, her heart, her desire. Words were minimal, unnecessary even, because every touch, every glance, every subtle shift of weight spoke volumes, a language more intimate and more powerful than speech, and she felt herself melting into it, letting go of all restraint, all fear, all doubt, and giving herself over to the intensity that had become her reality. Their lips met in a kiss that began gently, as always, almost reverent in its tenderness, and then deepened, growing urgent, demanding, a physical manifestation of the emotions that had been simmering between them, an unspoken confession of desire, trust, and surrender that needed no words to validate its truth. Every movement, every brush of skin against skin, was precise, deliberate, and charged with meaning, the gentleness he promised manifesting in the careful way he navigated the storm of passion, ensuring that every sensation was heightened, every touch remembered, every heartbeat synchronized with hers. Time seemed to collapse, hours slipping by unnoticed, leaving only the two of them in a space that existed outside reality, where every thought, every desire, every emotion was concentrated, magnified, and shared, creating a bond that felt unbreakable, inevitable, and intoxicating. She gasped, laughed softly, shivered, and cried out in the quiet moments between kisses, overwhelmed by the intensity, by the precision, by the intimacy that left her trembling yet grounded, terrified yet exhilarated, exposed yet cherished, a paradox she had never known could exist but now lived in with every fiber of her being. Between moments of passion, he would pull back slightly, searching her eyes, reading her reactions, whispering her name, reminding her that the gentleness he promised was never absent, that it was the foundation beneath the storm, the anchor beneath the fire, the steady hand guiding her through a night that would forever change the way she understood herself, him, and the intoxicating connection between them. Each encounter seemed to leave her both altered and awakened, a rawness that was frightening yet liberating, a craving for more that grew with every brush of his fingers. Every press of his lips, every whispered word that made her feel seen, understood, and desired in ways she had never imagined possible. They moved together seamlessly, a blend of urgency and restraint, passion and care, dominance and surrender, discovering boundaries that neither had known existed and pushing them just enough to thrill, excite, and awaken a fire within her that consumed thought, reason, and self-control. As the night deepened, they found moments of stillness, lying close, breathing in tandem, hearts racing in harmony, feeling the gravity of what had been created, the weight of the intimacy that had been established, and the undeniable truth that nothing between them could ever be ordinary again. She realized fully that her life had been rewritten, that every encounter had left a permanent mark on her body, her mind, and her heart, and that surrendering to him had not been a loss of control but a discovery of a depth of desire, trust, and connection she had never known she could feel. The gentleness he wielded was the most powerful force of all, transforming every touch into ecstasy, every whisper into a revelation, every look into a binding promise, and she found herself falling further, deeper, and more irrevocably into a connection that defied logic yet felt inevitable, essential, and absolute. In the quiet moments, when they were simply together, no words spoken, no kisses shared, she felt the full magnitude of their bond, a force that encompassed her entirely, a storm of sensation and emotion anchored by the unwavering gentleness that had become their signature, and she knew with certainty that this was only the beginning, that the nights ahead would challenge, consume, and transform her even further. When dawn began to seep through the windows, casting pale light across their entwined forms, she realized that she had surrendered again, fully, completely, body and soul, and that each encounter, each touch, each whisper, had reshaped her understanding of love, passion, and intimacy. As he left, lingering just long enough to press a soft kiss to her lips and whisper the familiar promise that it wasn't over, that their journey together was only beginning, she felt a mix of exhilaration, fear, and longing, knowing that the fire they had ignited between them would continue to burn, consuming every doubt, every hesitation, every boundary she had ever known. Alone, she collapsed onto the bed, her mind racing, her heart pounding, and her body humming with residual sensation, fully aware that her life had been transformed irrevocably, that she had surrendered to something far more intense, far more consuming, and far more exhilarating than anything she had ever known, and that the promise of gentleness had become the catalyst for a storm that would shape every heartbeat, every thought, and every decision from this night forward, leaving her utterly captivated, irrevocably changed, and longing for every moment yet to come. The night had fallen like a velvet curtain over the city, the streets below quiet except for the occasional hum of distant traffic, but inside the loft, the air was thick with anticipation, desire, and an intensity that neither of them could ignore or resist. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of them suspended in a moment that felt eternal, fragile, and unstoppable all at once. From the moment she opened the door and saw him standing there, calm yet commanding, every nerve in her body awakened, a mix of exhilaration, fear, and longing rushing through her veins as she realized that this night would be different, that it would mark a turning point she could not avoid and a transformation she had been longing for without even knowing it. His gaze, steady and penetrating, scanned her as though he could see every thought, every hesitation, every hidden desire, and she felt herself melt under the intensity, her resistance fading completely, leaving only the raw, undeniable pull between them that had grown stronger with every encounter they had shared. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and the familiar scent of the room, warm and intimate, enveloped her, making her pulse race as he approached, slow, deliberate, each movement measured yet filled with the promise of everything she had been craving, everything she had feared, and everything she had longed for. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of electricity that traveled through her entire body, igniting nerves she hadn't realized were so sensitive, and she shivered, unable to stop herself from leaning into him, drawn by a force she no longer questioned. Their eyes met, and in that silent moment, there was a shared understanding, an acknowledgement of everything they had been through, the stolen nights, the whispered promises, the surrendered fears, the relentless passion, and she realized that nothing in her life had prepared her for this intensity, nor could anything contain it now that it had been unleashed. The kiss that followed was soft at first, tentative, almost reverent, a delicate acknowledgement of their bond, and then it deepened, urgent, all-consuming, a storm of sensation and emotion that left her breathless, trembling, and utterly captivated, as if every moment before had been leading to this crescendo of desire, trust, and surrender. Every brush of skin, every whisper, every subtle gesture carried weight, meaning, and the promise of more, and she felt herself falling deeper into the storm, giving herself over entirely, knowing that surrender was no longer a choice but a necessity, a response to the irresistible gravity of his presence, his touch, and his unwavering attention. Hours passed in a blur of sensation and intimacy, a seamless rhythm of passion and gentleness, intensity and care, dominance and surrender, each movement meticulously crafted yet instinctive, each touch awakening new layers of feeling she had never experienced before, each whispered word sending shivers of anticipation and delight through her very soul. In the quiet moments between, when their breathing slowed, when their hearts raced in tandem, when the city outside remained oblivious to the world-altering connection taking place inside, she realized with absolute clarity that she had been irrevocably changed, that the nights they had shared had rewritten her understanding of desire, love, and trust, and that the promise he had whispered, the promise to be gentle, was not a simple assurance but a force that had reshaped her very being, opening doors to intensity, intimacy, and surrender she had never imagined possible. As the night deepened, their connection evolved, becoming more profound, more intricate, and more consuming, the boundaries between body, mind, and heart blurred, leaving only the undeniable, electric pull that bound them together in ways neither had anticipated but both had instinctively known were inevitable. Each kiss, each touch, each whispered confession became a testament to the depth of their bond, the power of trust, and the beauty of surrender, and she felt herself falling, not into chaos, but into a space where desire, love, and intimacy existed in perfect harmony, a place she had never known she could inhabit yet now could not imagine living without. He held her close, guiding her through waves of sensation and emotion, each moment carefully balanced between the fire of passion and the tenderness of gentleness, a delicate orchestration that left her simultaneously exhilarated. And grounded, consumed and safe, vulnerable yet cherished, a paradox that defined their relationship in the most intoxicating way imaginable. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, casting a soft glow across their entwined forms, she realized that she had surrendered fully, completely, and irrevocably, not just her body, but her heart, her mind, and her very sense of self, to the man who had whispered promises in the dark, who had guided her through desire, who had awakened something primal and profound within her, and who had changed her life forever with a single, gentle vow. The nights they had shared, the intimacy, the passion, the whispered words, and the careful balance of dominance and care had transformed her, had made her feel alive in ways she had never known, and had shown her that surrender, when guided by gentleness, could be the most powerful, freeing, and intoxicating force of all. As he finally stepped back, lingering just long enough to press a soft kiss to her forehead and whisper assurances that this was only the beginning, she felt a profound mix of exhilaration, longing, and peace, knowing that the journey they had embarked upon together was far from over, and that every moment yet to come would carry the same intensity, the same depth, and the same irreversible connection that had defined the nights leading to this one. Alone now, she sank onto the bed, her body tingling, her heart racing, her mind alive with every sensation and memory of the night, fully aware that nothing would ever be the same again, that every encounter had left a permanent mark, and that the man who had whispered, "I'll be gentle," had become the force that had rewritten her life, her desires, and her understanding of intimacy, leaving her utterly transformed, captivated, and ready for whatever the next chapter would bring. The city outside continued its rhythm, oblivious to the storm of passion, trust, and surrender that had unfolded within these walls, yet she knew that inside her, nothing would ever be ordinary again. Her heart, her mind, and her body had been forever touched, reshaped, and ignited by a single night, a single whisper, a single promise, and she welcomed it fully, knowing that the journey they had shared was only the beginning of a story that would consume, thrill, and define her in ways she could never have imagined, a story that would remain etched in her soul for all time.